Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Today, I'm talking about redshirting. You may know the term from college sports, where athletes can be redshirted for a year, keeping them out of the game, but giving them an extra year of eligibility. Kindergarten redshirting is a similar concept, giving kids an extra year beyond their eligibility before enrolling them in kindergarten. I'll confess, I personally cringe at the term because I think it conveys, to some at least, the idea that kids are being held back to give them an advantage at sports, which arguably some are. But the reasons why parents give their kids an extra year before starting kindergarten reach much beyond that. Today, I'm joined by my friend Allison McDonald, who writes at No Time for Flashcards. She's a teacher, a book author, a graduate student, a marathoner, and a mom to 2 rad kids. Yeah, she really is that awesome. She and I are chatting today about why some parents choose to give their kids an extra year, what that means from a systems perspective, what factors play into the individual decisions from a personal perspective, and some of the other options that parents may not have considered. I have a lot of parents ask me about my opinion about kindergarten redshirting, and like many parenting dilemmas, it just doesn't have an easy, clean answer. So I'm glad Allie's here to help me sort through the information. You can find the show notes, including links to Allie's site and some of the resources we reference, at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 7. We have a lot of ground to cover with this one, so let's jump in. Hi, Allie. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Hello.
It's good to have you. So just for those listening, Allie and I have been friends for quite a while, and we have a lot of conversations that are not on the public domain of the blogosphere. And so I knew that when I wanted to talk about redshirting, I knew Allie was the one that I wanted to talk to, because Allie, you have this way of seeing things that isn't just as a mom and isn't just as an educator, but like the whole system. And that's really what I want to address when we talk about redshirting. So first, what I thought we'd jump in on is what some of the reasons are for parents choosing to redshirt. I think because the term has this callback to sports, I think sometimes the first thing people think of is, giving kids that extra year, that advantage when it comes to athletics in junior high and high school and I guess college. But I would assume that's probably pretty low on people's list, and that's actually why I kind of cringe at the term redshirting, because to me, I think parents' reasoning, I'm sure athletics comes on the list for some people, but I think there are a lot of different reasons that parents consider giving their kids an extra year. So what are some of the ones that you've heard?
More than anything, and what's funny is I never knew. I'm not a sports watcher at all. I'm athletic, but I don't watch sports. So I had no clue that any parent would ever think to hold their child back for sports. Right. But I'm married to a Texan. So when we were first discussing it, when our eldest was 4 or 5, and we were discussing it, and I had read a study, and I was annoyed by it. And he was like, that many people hold them back for sports? And I was like, what are you talking about, sports? I was completely confused. So you're right. I don't think it is really about sports anymore. I think the main thing is that so many people, and we have to remember how information to parents kind of get out. There's so much information coming so quickly at parents. And how many of us read every article we share? Really, truly, we know that doesn't happen. And so there's a lot of fear about how academic kindergarten is. And a lot of people are just like, do you know what? When I was a kid, kindergarten was this way. It was half a day. In that half day, we managed to have a nap too. It was different. And those are really those are grounded in reality fears, because kindergarten is very different than it was when we were kids. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to hold all the kids back. So I think that for parents, it's really a matter of wanting to, one, let their kids be kids for an extra year is what I hear often. They're worried that their child is not academically developed enough. So I don't want to say gifted, because that has nothing to do with it. But they're not, developed literacy-wise or numeracy-wise
They're
enough
worried
yet.
they'll start out behind.
That's exactly it. Or they're worried about them socially.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, really, in a lot of ways, redshirting is based on worry and concern for their kids. And so I think those are the three main things that parents are worried about.
And it can be different for different parents and for different kids where their worry is the biggest, you know, depending on what's going on in their home, their family, with their kids, and what's going on in their community and expectations. So those can all be different. And there may be even worries that we haven't thought of. There may be other concerns that are motivating parents. But it's becoming fairly common. And I think what you hit on touches on a lot of that this perception, and there's some validity to it, though it varies from program to program, that kindergarten has changed, kind of this attitude that if kindergarten is now the new first grade, I'll send them a first grader instead of a kindergartner, right?
That's exactly it. And the thing is, I mean, and parents, and I don't want to say, like, as much as, like, I'll be totally, like, outright. I am, in general, not a fan of redshirting. Mm-hmm. But that's not saying I think any parent has made a mistake. Right. And I'll get into that more. But I think that the thing is that, like, kindergarten really isn't, like, the place for a lot of 5-year-olds. And so parents have a very valid concern about their 5-year-old going off to kindergarten. And my son was an older 5-year-old. He turned 6 in November. And my daughter, she turned 6 after kindergarten was done. So we sent her right at 5. I mean, she was like a few weeks into 5, and most of her class were a year to almost 2 years older than her. So every child, exactly like you said, every child is different. I don't know what I would have done if my son had been the younger one. And really, it's boys that so much of this is focused on, much more than girls, which is interesting, too. Because,
that is interesting.
Mm-hmm. I'm like, let's talk about development and how we just accept things so, like, oh, yeah, boys just aren't ready. Really? We need to look at the kid.
Exactly, that it's individual. And you mentioned it just on this, I wanted to talk first kind of on the system level. When, like you mentioned, that kindergarten sometimes isn't the place for a 5-year-old. Unfortunately, that in a lot of situations, kindergarten is no longer really attuned to what we know about how 5-year-olds grow and learn and participate. And
no, it's not.
So there's this system issue that's kind of reinforcing a decision to delay. But then what I think I had really overlooked for a long time, I think you were the first one that kind of called me on it in our discussions, that we don't realize that by holding kids back, we also reinforce that system. Do you want to explain that thinking just from a systems viewpoint? We're not talking about individuals yet.
So really, I mean, the problem is that so you've got this structure of the classroom that is now getting more and more academic. And if we're holding back children that aren't ready for it and only putting in kids that are ready for it, it's only going to continue to get less appropriate for those 5-year-olds. We're not talking about the 6-year-olds. So, I mean, it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy where you are creating a system that is more and more advanced. In the meantime, you're holding back kids. So it's so hard to not jump back to the individual. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with a parent choosing to redshirt their child, period, ever. Mm-hmm. What I think is wrong is that the system allows it, which then perpetuates the system, because there will always be children who cannot be redshirted, no matter what their parents want to do. And we're not talking about, like, poverty-stricken children. We know that children in poverty will not be redshirted. Like, if a parent can choose to send their child to a preschool all day, every day, and not have to pay for childcare, or send them to a free public school, the vast majority, we're not talking about just poverty-stricken, but the vast majority of American families need to make that free public school choice for their financial viability. So you've got this big group of people that don't even have the choice to redshirt or not. And then you've got a group of families that can make the choice, and I don't blame them for making that choice. But in the meantime, what's happening is this big group with a much wider spectrum of abilities are now in one classroom. Or maybe it's not one classroom or one district, but one state. Mm-hmm. They're all still facing the same standards. That's right. The issue, right?
And yeah, so like you're saying, when we have, again, individual choice is a different topic we'll get to, but because we have in the system, we'll have some children who are held back. So you already have in kindergarten, you've got a very wide array of abilities, and then you throw in an extra year, and now you've got this huge span. So I think as a system, what we want is for an environment that responds well enough to the child that parents don't feel like they need to make that choice.
Exactly.
Because the reality is the parents who can make the choice, their children are already at an advantage because they're in a higher socioeconomic bracket, generally speaking. And so it's like we're further disadvantaging disadvantaged kids because they don't have, like you mentioned, and it's again not poverty, but just because the choices are more limited because in a higher SES bracket or someone with more resources or advantage, whatever level or label you want to put on it, they can choose to give their child an extra year, send them to a quality preschool, or maybe somebody can choose to give them an extra year, but then they don't have access to resources or support, or they just, like you mentioned, cannot financially keep them home one more year. So it's taking this wide breadth already, this wide swath of young children, and then it's compounding the disadvantages for certain kids, and then it's reinforcing a system that, again, like you said, will say, well, it's what's your problem that you can't keep up with our escalating standards, but it's kind of been skewed by who's getting sent to kindergarten.
Absolutely. That's exactly the issue because, I mean, any kindergarten teacher, no matter what, and I'm speaking for kindergarten teachers even though I'm not one, but they will have such a spectrum of abilities in their classroom. And part of that is based on what preschool the children went to, if they went to preschool, how their parents worked with them. But part of it is just that development in young children is so varied when they're in early childhood. It just is. It doesn't really level out until like second grade. And then, of course, it's still individual child. But, I mean, huge developmental differences.
Just by the nature of development. That's how human development works.
Exactly. It's normative at this age, basically. So by spreading it out, not only academically are the standards getting kind of skewed, but socially they are too. Mm-hmm. So you've got like, well, why can't she sit for so long? Well, because she's 5. Well, she wasn't ready for kindergarten. No. Hold up. Kindergarten should be ready for 5-year-olds. 5-year-olds shouldn't be ready for kindergarten. And that's the issue. And that's the issue over and over. And, I don't have a magic like pill for how do we fix this? Because we can't tell parents not to, at least I don't see it ever happening in this country, not to hold their child back. And we can't force a 5-year-old to act like a 6-year-old. So, basically it's put on the teachers to be able to differentiate to a huge degree. And no human being can do that, flawlessly.
Right. So, and even if they could, there's so many parameters and restrictions that are set on them. There are a lot of kindergarten teachers who would say, I could do a better job of differentiating, but I have these pressures and I have these requirements and I have, so you've got all these factors that make it really difficult to attend to such a huge swath. So we look at that from a systems perspective that essentially we have an imperfect system and that the act of redshirting can perpetuate that or exacerbate that. But the oversimplified solution is that we should create a system that is ready for 5-year-olds and that is ready for and responsive to that huge differentiation of human development, that it can be responsive to that different developmental levels. And I love how you said it, that kindergarten will be ready for the 5-year-olds, that no parent feels like they have to make the choice. And And so bringing it to the parental level, and we keep saying this because we knew we were going to get there, that it does come down to individuals. And like you and I would both agree, we would prefer a system that didn't make parents feel like they needed to make this choice. We would prefer a system that was ready for all 5-year-olds.
Right.
But reality being what it is, and parenting being what it is, I really feel strongly that parents just have to do what's best for their own kids, and that we are our kids' best advocate, for making sure that they get what they need. So that in mind, you and I, between the two of us, have 6 kids, and we've made different decisions for different kids. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of our different decisions and how we got to where we did. Do you want to go first with yours?
Sure. So my son, I didn't even have, it wasn't a, decision. He was November, and he was already reading, and he was, I wasn't worried about him being behind. I was worried about him being bored. And he was bored, even though he's a very bright boy. He's very social, but he's not like particularly gifted or anything like that. He gets good grades, and he was a little bit bored, but that happens in kindergarten. Like, the teacher was like, he's reading already, he might get a little bored. Like, I know, don't worry, we'll supplement. And so I didn't even have to really worry about anything with him. He was so far off. But my daughter, a late June birthday, in pre-K, people started asking me, are you doing another year? Is she doing another year of preschool? Are you holding her back? And I was like, no, absolutely not. And I struggled with that. Like, I was very sure of myself outwardly. No, she's ready. Oh, academically. And she was. Academically, she is far and above. But socially, she was already having trouble socially in pre-K. So I was worried about her socially. Absolutely. And a lot of people, oh, she's a girl, she'll be fine. I'm like, have you met her? Like, really? Because she emotionally has always been younger than her age, always. And so I did struggle with that privately. I put on a very strong face publicly, but privately I did struggle with it. I was trying to decide. And she struggled in kindergarten. She had a great teacher. We discussed stuff a lot. Her behavior was not good. And it was hard. And it was only really, really recently that I finally decided that it was the best choice. And that was only because she went through a whole bunch of evaluation, and it turns out she's highly gifted. And the psychologist was like, no, it would have been even worse. Like, I know she struggled, but it would have been worse had you held her back. So that was, but I don't think a lot of parents get that, expert opinion to make them feel better. Exactly. Like, they don't get that validation. But we don't get that with anything with parenting. So much of parenting is you get what you get, you make the most of it, and you hope that you've made the right choice. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing is that there's a lot of studies on redshirting, and because my master's thesis is hopefully, the research that I will be doing is hopefully about developmentally appropriate practice in kindergarten, it speaks to that. And so I've read a lot of research about this, and almost no parents ever report that they regret holding their child back. It's very rare. It's self-reporting of it is like ridiculously high. But the thing is that to me shouldn't even be a measure, because we validate ourselves with our decisions. Right. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard to say. However, I think that, as a parent, no one knows your child better than you do. Absolutely. And I don't think, and this is totally just my opinion, this isn't anything based on research, I don't think that sending them or not sending them is going to make or break their education. Mm-hmm. It's going to be how you support them through those next 13 years that will make or break their education. So, I think parents should go with their gut and see do I think that they'll thrive? Here's the deal. No kindergartner thrives every single day in kindergarten. Like,
right.
Whether you hold them back or you don't, there's going to be those days where they come home and you're like, where's my child? And who is this who's just gotten off the bus screaming at me? And there's going to be days where you get a call and they've wet their pants. Like, there's always going to be something.
It's going to be a transition regardless.
It is. And it's such a huge transition. And I don't think we focus on the emotional side of it enough. And so for me, I did wonder, but, all of us have that one kid that we worry, or it's not one kid. I should say we all go through phases with our kids where we worry more about them than the other kids, or they're struggling more. And so kindergarten was a real struggle for my daughter last year. And so I did second guess myself for a while. And I think that's just parenting, though. So if I was giving any parent advice, it would be just to follow their gut.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard to do sometimes, but I say the same thing. Like, research, do all that you can, and then at the end of the day, you just have to listen to yourself, and you know what you know, and trust that gut instinct, inspiration, whatever you want to call it. But again, I think a parent, like you said, knows their child best and is their number one advocate, and no one will know and do for your child what you can do.
And just don't worry about being judged either. I know both you and I live in kind of small school districts, and a lot of people are like, oh, I just don't think she was ready, or oh, he's not ready. Oh, don't worry about the peanut gallery, okay? You worry about your kid.
Right.
And don't worry, but that's like a real valid concern for a lot of people. Like, it's so, being a parent is just like such a target for being judged. And you just have to like smile, nod, and keep walking. Just keep doing it.
Just, do what you know is best for your kids.
Yes.
Now, my experience was kind of flipped, which is the other reason why I loved having this discussion, because like you said, I wanted to emphasize there is no one right answer.
Yes.
And I get a lot of parents that ask me about this topic, and there is no one right answer other than, do all the research you can and make the best decision you can based on what you know about your child. And for me, same thing. My oldest was past the deadline, so he went in as an older kindergartner regardless, just because of the deadline. And then my next son is an early June birthday, and we did choose to give him an extra year. And it sounds kind of similar to your daughter. He, academically, I think would have been fine. My big concern was just emotionally and just the self-regulation, and he was still kind of having these big blow-ups and emotional outbursts and that sort of thing when he was 4. And really a lot of what influenced my decision, my husband and I, but for me, I had spent a lot of time in a kindergarten classroom volunteering, and it ended up not being the school where we sent him. But at the time, it seemed like this is a high probability this could be his teacher. And this teacher in particular just really struggled with a lot of classroom management skills, we'll say.
Right.
And I could see I could see that she didn't handle these personality types or these types of needs that I saw him having. She didn't handle it in a very productive way. And I saw one child in particular who was struggling in that classroom, and I knew he was one of the youngest kids. And I just thought, that's going to be my son if I send him. And I knew, one piece of research that influenced me, but again, on a personal level, I don't mean to extrapolate it out to everyone or overgeneralize, but there is some research on ADHD, and that it tends to be more, they broke it down by age, and the youngest in the class tended to be more likely to be diagnosed, because part of the diagnostic process is compared to other children his or her age, do they do this more or less? Do they exhibit this behavior more or less? And so it's kind of, it's norm reference based on their age. And so if you're a teacher in a classroom and you're filling out that survey and you're referencing the other kids in their class and they're the youngest child, well, then of course they have fewer, self-control skills and will exhibit these types of behavior because it's developmental. But when you get into this norm referenced observation and there's actually a 1 or 2 year difference between their peers, it kind of gets skewed. And so that's kind of what the data was showing, that we get skewed sometimes because we're comparing them against children who are actually older than they are. And the reason that influenced me was because some of the behavior I saw him exhibiting, I knew wasn't ADHD, but I was afraid that teachers would start to see it that way just because he was younger and more immature.
Right.
And I was really nervous about him being labeled as a hard kid or...
Oh, yeah.
I had all these worries, the parental worries that you talked about. And I almost laugh at it now because he's now a fourth grader and just his teachers have loved him. And he has done really well. And I'd like to think that it's because, again, that my husband and I made this
right.
great choice of giving him this extra year. And maybe that made a difference and maybe it didn't. You know, maybe he just knew how to behave well when he got into a school situation and that it was different. But I don't regret making that choice. And like you said, that's what we do. But I can see where he has really blossomed. And there were some things where I think some skills that did come online later for him. And maybe they would have come earlier if he had been in that environment earlier. It's hard to say. You really can't. It's not a
right.
scientific study when we do this. But I felt good about the choice that we made. And I see him really blossoming and doing well. And then our next son is really not that much, on the calendar year, not that much behind him, but we didn't give him that extra year. It's about a 2-month difference. So it did seem silly that, it'd be springtime rather than summer. And he did great where he's at. And he had different personality and different experiences and different environment. But now where we're stuck is our fourth son, I think will start kindergarten next year. But he is really on the calendar only a week different than the son we gave an extra year to. And so every once in a while I go back and forth and think, does he need that extra year? Does he not need that extra year? And sometimes when I'm really honest, I think, is it me? Do I need the extra year? And it's
right.
not about him. It's that I'm nervous about letting go of this preschool phase of our family that's now ending with this son, and so I have to get really honest about what my motivations are. And I think more than likely we'll send him. I think that's kind of where we're leaning at this point. But again, I wanted to go through our experiences to illustrate and highlight that there's not a one right answer, that you take it child by child, year by year, and you just kind of have to look at, what do I know, what do I feel, and what's the best decision that we can make.
And I think
all these
too,
circumstances.
You hit on the fact of, like, I really think that these skills are developmental and your son would get there. What's so interesting is that my gut, I knew that the behavior issues that I saw at my daughter were not developmental. Mm-hmm. They were things that we were seeking out help for. They were things that I felt would be there no matter what. And it sounds it sounds very cold to be like, oh, I'm going to send her anyway, even though she's going to pretend to be a chicken when she's upset, but.
But I think that's really important. It's an important thing to get to, because if we are giving them the extra year because they're struggling with something, the reality is they might get the best support for that struggle in a school system that has those supports present. That there may be things that are found and addressed and supported a year later if we give them that extra year. That this early intervention, I think you're hitting on something really important, that if it's just a matter of needing some, extra time develop, it's along a normal developmental progression and we just feel like they need an extra year, versus I think they're going to struggle, but it's because there's something that needs our attention right now. And sometimes when you give them that extra year, you won't get to those services as early as you might if you go ahead and send them and get that support and those services addressed.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, realistically, preschools quality preschools can be great quality preschools and not have the ability to have that early intervention. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely, I think that, I just knew in my gut, I was like, this isn't something she's just going to develop. Like, this is something that we're going to have to, let's do this by fire. Let's jump in and face it as we can, So, but that was all just knowing your child.
Yeah.
And knowing, what is going to be the best road. It won't necessarily be the easiest road.
Exactly.
But it will be the best road.
That just thinking kindergarten's going to be really hard next year isn't the reason to give them an extra year, because maybe it needs to be hard because we need to address something.
Oh, yeah.
It's not that simple as just saying it'll be hard next year, so let's give it another year.
Yes. And I spent a lot of money on wine for my daughter's teacher. I'm not even joking. Every teacher appreciation gift included wine for her. I was like, I just need to know what your favorite wine is because I'm just going to start buying it at Costco. Because it was a rough year and I feel terrible. But on the same note, I mean, transitions for some kids are really transitions are hard for all kids, but some kids are just a lot more resilient. And if they're not facing any extra, issues or challenges, then they can use that and they can make those transitions successfully. And other kids just struggle. And our job as parents when we see our kids struggle is to face it. So
right. And I think that's another thing, like we've talked about, that it's going to be a hard transition anyway. So for those, whenever you choose to send your child to kindergarten, when they are having a hard time with that transition, don't spend so much time second guessing yourself and blaming yourself for sending them whenever you sent them. Just like you said, just recognize and face this is a hard thing and we can do hard things, and let's grow through the challenge. Let's grow through what we're facing. We want to, I do as parents, I want to make everything okay all the time, but our kids don't grow through that. We want to keep it to a healthy level. But I just think as parents, sometimes we see our kids having a hard time and we think we've done something wrong.
Yes. Instead of just realizing they're growing.
Right. That the reality is that, that's why they call them growing pains, right? It's not always easy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about was just also helping parents to recognize that it's not just an either or, black or white. Do you give them an extra year? Do you not give them an extra year? But that there are other ways that we can see, this might be a hard transition. What can I do to support this? Or how can I be flexible with this? Like you mentioned, that there's some things we can support at home and say, I'm going to go ahead and send you, but I can see that this is going to be maybe more of a challenge for you than for other children. Here are some things that we can do. Or just thinking outside of the box. I know I have one reader, and this is not going to be the fit for everyone, but she wrote and told me that she sat down with the principal and the teacher of one of her children in kindergarten, and they structured out a plan. I can't remember exactly what they did, but I think she picked up her son at a half-day point rather than sending him all day long, and that worked for them. She, like I said, she didn't just go rogue and pull him out all the time, but she sat down and talked with the principal and the teacher and said, let's find something that works. Here are my child's needs. How can we think outside of the box and be flexible? And so that's, I think, just helping parents to recognize it's not just either or, but it's really, there are so many different ways that we can be responsive to our kids and their individual needs. So what are some thoughts that you have? And I've got a few on my mind in addition to that we can go beyond just I send them or I give them an extra year, but just how do we support our kids in this kindergarten transition at whatever point?
I think part of it is realizing how much efficacy parents really do have. Like, parents have a lot of voice, but you have to use it to get it. And you have to get over the worry that you're the annoying parent that's emailing the teacher again. And I am that parent because I have a child with a lot of challenges in the school setting. And so, I worry about that as well. But ultimately, I don't care. My job is to be an advocate. And so I think one of the things is realizing that you have the ability to go in and talk to the principal and say, listen, here is what I'm seeing and here is where I want to be. How can you help me get there? Principals in general, especially elementary school principals, are so eager to have parents involved. And not just at a superficial level, not just like, I'm at the PTO meeting again, which isn't to say, which isn't to say that superficial. We need PTOs. But like truly a parent who's engaged and interested and, willing to do the hard work, education-wise with their kids. And a lot of administrators don't have any early childhood training.
This is true.
You really do need to be an advocate for your child. So personally, stuff that I did, looking at one that if a parent holds their child back and then realizes, oh crap, maybe I should have sent them, they're bored now. That's nothing to do with their age. They could have been bored earlier too. One of the things for kids that are bored in kindergarten to do is to address it right away. Don't be like, oh, maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll get better. Talk to the teacher right away. And and try and frame it so it doesn't sound like you're boring my kid, you know?
Right. How can I help you?
Kindergarten teachers have like a special place in heaven. They are amazing. They work so hard. And,
so true.
And they have so much on their plate, and it's such a tricky class and grade to teach. So I think that, you know, really being that person to say, hey, you know, we're seeing a lot of this at home. Is there anything you can do for it? Is there anything I can do for it? Mm-hmm. And, you know, some kids just need to be supplemented more. And like for my son, I mean, he did an activity after school for my blog almost every day after kindergarten. He would go chill out for a while, then do that, and then do homework. Now, on the topic of homework, my daughter did no homework at all last year. I was just like, she won't be doing homework. Like, my son did all of it. It was too much for her. So it was just too much because already she was dealing with, you know, writing her own directions to every worksheet. Right. I mean, she had her own ideas about everything. So it was just like, do you know what, this is going to make her work in class even worse because this will burn her out even more. Mm-hmm. And I think parents need to realize that they have a say in a lot of this. And I say that knowing that we do in my school district. Like, where I am, the parents have a good active role and there's a good relationship. And not every school district is like that. I have friends in Florida whose kindergartner was given detention for not doing homework.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Like,
wow.
Whenever someone says something ridiculous, I'm always like, are you in Florida? Like, which, I mean, I'm sorry for listeners who are in Florida, but please, like, write me with the good because I only ever hear the not so good. And so if you're able to, look at ways that you can do it. I love the shortening of the day idea. I love that. Mm-hmm. I know of people who have repeated kindergarten. They did a half day, like if your district has half day, which a lot don't anymore, but she didn't think that her son was totally ready for full day kindergarten. So she did half day, and then they moved up to full day 6 months in. So she switched classes, which there had to be room, and I mean, there was a lot of asking, but that's how she did it. So at Christmas, he moved up to a full day. So, which I found interesting too.
Yeah, that's one option my husband and I have talked about, you know, when we've said, let's think outside of the box, because I'm not sure that starting him a year later for our youngest now, I'm not sure that starting him a year later is really going to be the right choice in the long run, but we've kind of thrown out all these other ideas. Can we look at a different kindergarten option, or just for half of the year, you know, find a different kindergarten program and then transition him over, or, you know, that there are those different avenues. And I think it's important to say, and I think we've had this conversation before, that we do tend to tense up sometimes. I know I have, when we think all day kindergarten. My oldest two, it was part day kindergarten, and then for my youngest two, it's full day. And we tend to worry and think, oh, it's all day kindergarten. Automatically, that is not developmentally appropriate. That's a long day. It's this huge transition. But what we actually know, based on research and feedback, is that it, again, varies program to program and school district to district, but that in a full day program, there's actually more room for play. So what we see in some systems is that because it's a full day, they get to keep the dramatic play area. They get to keep more recess time. I'll link to one of the studies I've looked at that when they compared full day to half day, there were more occurrences of some of these developmentally appropriate things because it wasn't so rushed. So I think we have to be careful that we don't automatically jump into this idea that, oh, a half day is always better. Not necessarily. It may be more pressure in a half day where they're trying to get the same information into a shorter amount of time. So be aware of that it's not just half day is better. It depends.
Oh, absolutely. All the research.
What they're doing with the time matters more than the amount of time.
I haven't found any research that goes against that. Everything supports the fact that there's room for more play and more downtime and more developmentally appropriate just structure of the classroom even. So no, completely agree with that. And really when we look at, you know, what are the pressures in our school systems that are creating this less developmentally appropriate environment, and the pressures are coming from the top down. And the teachers in a half-day program have less time to produce the same thing. Which, I mean, no one wants to think of kids as production, but it is, we are looking at, you know.
They still look at the output.
They do. We are an output-based school system right now. So they still have to get that done in less time. So I'm glad we definitely did full day. And I think that a lot of parents do make that assumption that a half day is more developmentally appropriate. And that their kids are going to be exhausted. Well, do you know what? Your kids are going to be exhausted either way, I think. And you're just putting the full day transition 1 year later, which is a massive transition. I think that's more of a transition.
Regardless.
Yeah.
I taught first graders who had half day kindergarten, and seeing that transition in those first few weeks, that was hard. It was hard for them, and it was hard for me. But we get through it, and you grow, and by the time you get to the end of the year, you're laughing that it was so hard. But all that said, it is a lot of time and a lot of pressure and adjustment. And I know for me with my first son that went into full day kindergarten, I just told myself, you know, he's ready. He had more preschool than any of my other boys. And I just told myself, this is kindergarten. There's no reason to stress out over things. So there were days that he said he had a stomach ache or he didn't want to go to school. And so I would drop off the older boys and we would drive a few extra miles to the bay and throw rocks. And I would call the school and say, you know, I'm going to get him there a little bit later. We would just, and again, that's, you know, my personal privilege that I had that extra time that I could do that. But I just kind of kept in mind that that I would take my cues from him. And if he needed a morning off or a 15-minute late start or those sorts of things, that I would try as much as I could without overindulging or throwing off everything else, that I would give him that grace. And I do think it helped, and I think it lessened as the year went on. He didn't, you know, we weren't late every single day, but there were days that I would just call and say, he's got a little bit of a stomach ache right now, but I think we're going to get him there in half an hour or so, and just not turn it into a power struggle or a guilt trip, but just, you know, we didn't go back home and turn on cartoons, but we just said, when you're ready, we'll go. Let's go throw some rocks in the water for a little bit, and we'll get you in there. So I think just recognizing that it is still kindergarten, and so if your transition means, you know, I'm gonna sit with you in the parking lot for a little extra time, or I'm gonna walk you in every single day, you know, we can take our cues from our kids and just give a little bit of flexibility when they need it, when we can.
Well, I think you hit a really good point that it's kindergarten. And I think so often, especially with high-achieving parents, which the area I live in is filled with high-achieving parents, people get worried, like, well, what are his grades? I'm like, it's kindergarten. Like, I just don't, it's not that I don't care what my child is learning. I just don't necessarily care about the output right now. I'm more concerned about my child in kindergarten and first grade being able to learn how to be in kindergarten and first grade than I am worried about, you know, what number they have on their report card. Like, I want to make sure they're learning how to learn, and they're learning the concepts, the major concepts, but not necessarily that they never make a mistake.
Right.
And that they get 100% on this test or that test. And so I think that, you know, people worry so much about being late or being, you know, and I'm privileged as well in the sense that our school system, my district doesn't seem to really be strict about tardies all that much as long as we call in, you know, whereas other school districts, you need doctor's notes after so many. And I'd be like, what?
Right.
We all go to the same doctor here, too. Like, what? So I think that, you know, for me, part of it was like during my daughter's kindergarten year, every single appointment was during school day. Every appointment I made for her, and she had weekly play therapy appointments, it was during a school day. It gave her respite from all of it. And, yeah, like both my kids when they were in kindergarten, I don't feel good. Okay. No worries. We'll stay home today. Yeah. You know?
I think sometimes, like you said, we get caught in that pressure of how we look as parents. And so, you know, we have this power struggle, or we're getting feedback from our kids that they're stressed out, and instead we put on more stress and pressure because we feel the stress and pressure. And so sometimes if we can be cognizant about that and just relax a little bit. And again, we, don't overindulge it, and systems vary. And so you have to respond the way that you most responsibly can. But just again, recognizing that your child is 5, and giving a little bit of flexibility to be responsive to what they need. It will really help in the transition if you can, have some of those responsive moments to give them a little bit of help in those areas.
I think it's
when they need it.
Sorry, yes, absolutely. I'm here like cheering on. I think so much of it is being responsive and also being confident in your choices as a parent. I mean, so much of parenting comes down to that. And it's like 90% fake it till you make it, right? Like,
right.
I mean, I remember being my son was totally stressed out. He was having a hard time with a certain math concept, and he had just had a test, and he was like, Mom, I feel sick. And I could tell he was anxious. There was nothing he had to face at school that day. When my kids are anxious and there's something they have to face, that's when I carry them and put them on the bus, because they have to face it. I can't let them hide from a math test. But if their body is exhausted and stressed out because the day before they faced that anxiety or that stress, I'm like, go back to sleep. I have to go to Costco later. You can come with me. And at Costco, I saw another parent, and he was clearly fine by this point in the day. But it was too late to go to school, and I was like, an hour away anyway. So he's reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and this parent is looking at me like, why isn't he in school? And I was like, he needed a mental health day. And I just walked away. And like 2 weeks later, this parent that I had felt judged by was like, thank you so much for doing that. Like, thank you for just owning up to that and not making an excuse, because like, we need to do that for our kids. And I was like, oh, thank you for telling me that.
Because it helps them, but it helps you when it reinforces. But there are times we just have to realize that we do what we need to do, and we our responsibility is to our kids first and foremost. And we get caught up in some of the other pressures. And I think that's the culmination of all of this, is that we just have to do what's best for our kids. And, of course, with respect to the system and making sure that we do what we can to be respectful and to make it work. But at the end of the day, our responsibility is to our kids first and foremost. And I think you mentioned earlier about our school system being a top-down, the pressure comes top-down. But in that same vein, you talked about parents as advocates, that really the top of a public school system is the parents, really. And you can see so many instances where parent input and support and pressure changes what's going on in schools. And so I think we can remember, too, that we can change what's going on in the kindergarten, that when schools hear our concerns, that it can change things, and that sometimes they just, the system will just go on as it is if we just accept it. But I've heard from people who say, I'm taking this research to my school, and maybe it was only a little change. Maybe we got a little bit more recess, or maybe we got on Fridays now we finally have play centers, and we wish it was every day. But these little changes are made because parents are willing to step in and say, here's my concern. Here's the research and what we know. How can I help make a change in our school? And recognizing, as you've mentioned before, that parents have so much power in a public school dynamic, that we sometimes see ourselves at the bottom of it, and we're really at the top of a school system for our kids. And again, because at the end of the day, our responsibility is to our children.
Absolutely. And I think, too, that's not a matter of us not supporting the teachers. It's completely opposite.
Right.
As the top, we have the power to, teachers want to do, and they know, and they've been taught, as I've taken these classes, we know what is best for a kid. But teachers are not making the decisions. Mm-hmm. And so the parents being involved help those teachers get, what is best for the kids to be happening inside those schools.
Right. So there are things we can advocate for as parents that teachers just can't, because it's not the appropriate channel, that just like you're saying, that they want to be able to do things that they're not being allowed to do, and they can't necessarily bring that up as a grievance, but that we as parents can.
Absolutely.
And we have to recognize that we have that advocacy role, and that, again, we don't want to bring it on as an adversarial relationship, but just as, we're trying to help our kids, we're trying to support our teachers, and this is how we see that working best. Again, to recognize we can help the teachers as well, and making ourselves available, whether it's on a small scale of just, can I come in and run some centers, would that help you? Or if it's a larger scale of, I've read articles of states where full-scale parents are writing these letters about some inappropriate testing that was being done on kindergartners, and they changed it because they got enough people who used their voice, and it made a difference. Exactly. It's so many parents feel like they don't have a say. And a lot of parents also don't want to be seen as being adversarial to teachers, which I completely agree with. We're on the same team. We are the same team. And it's so hard sometimes to know when to step in and when not to step in and who to go to and what to say. But unless you start the conversation, nothing's going to get done. Right. I think we should have a whole other episode on how to be an amicable advocate for our kids, because I know that's another topic that all unto itself of how to go about it in the right channels. So we'll have to do that again and have that conversation. I would love to. But what you've shared today, I think, is really, really helpful for parents to hear, to recognize that there's no one right way. Once again, the one thing we know about parenting, there's no one right way to do it all, and that we can take all the information we can find, make the best decision for our kids, and have some flexibility and try to adapt and respond to our kids. That this kindergarten transition is going to be a big one regardless of when they do it, but that parents can have confidence to make the best decision for their kids in their situations and do the best thing that they can for the kids, knowing, like you said, that decision will pale in comparison to the wholeness of what they do as parents in just every day, in and out, supporting and loving and responding to their kids. So thanks for lending your voice and your experience to this conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I think the most important thing is exactly what you closed with, which is the fact that you go with your gut, you go with all the information you have, and you realize that this one decision isn't going to make or break your child's education. So it's okay if you regret. Either way, just keep going forward, keep advocating for your kid. Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Allie. Thanks for having me. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 7. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com, and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.